When fire hydrants ran dry in the Pacific Palisades, it sparked a wave of criticism and even misinformation.
Because Karen Bass didn't fill the reservoirs. So all the fire reservoirs were not, so the fire trucks are there, they couldn't pump water.
They cut the water off.
They don't have water.
Surveys show LA did have water, but amid widespread frustration and a report that a local reservoir in the Palisades was offline and empty due to repairs, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a review of Los Angeles Water and Power. Here's how the water supply system works and what we know about why hydrants ran out of water at the height of the Palisades fire. About 2/3 of LA County's water comes from sources outside of LA. And because LA is surrounded by mountains and hills, much of that water has to be pushed up to higher elevations.
Well, water is heavy, relatively speaking, and so it takes energy to pump it upstream.
Eric Porce, director of the California Institute for Water Resources, says you can think of the system sort of like a tree with interconnected branches. There are big trunk mains that move water from a source, like a water treatment plant or a reservoir, and carry it to smaller distribution mains, which split off from the trunk. From there, the water is moved through even smaller pipes or lateral lines that carry water to homes, businesses, and fire hydrants. In some areas, tanks and reservoirs are placed throughout the system to help maintain pressure, because pressure is what pushes water into all of the nodes. But during the LA wildfires, officials said intense demand overwhelmed the system, which drained several tanks and meant that there wasn't enough pressure to push water to hydrants up in the Palisades.
So that's an interesting case that they're trying to make here, which is, I think they're trying to say that the pressure is what prevented water from going out. That still seems to be the same case of them running out of water. Obviously, if you need a certain amount of water in the reservoirs for you to maintain a particular pressure to keep moving water around, then you still effectively ran out of water. It's just that you weren't completely out of water. Like, you weren't able to use 100% of your water. The issue I think that they're describing is they use 50, 60, 70, 80%, whatever that number is, and they still had some water left, but they just didn't have enough of it to be able to push it around with the pressure that exists. That still sounds like a pretty serious problem to me, but maybe they're going to elaborate more on that.
I want to make sure that you understand there's water in the trunk line. It just cannot get off the hill because we cannot fill the tank fast enough.
Officials say there wasn't a lack of water in LA, and data shows that major California reservoirs were at or above historic averages when the fires broke out. But in a letter to LA officials...
That is interesting. So I'm just going to go back to this chart. So they're sort of highlighting that the expectation is that actually they had more water than they usually do. Something else broke in the system. So I think, for context, I think everyone can probably agree the people who needed water weren't able to get their water one way or the other. Whether or not the reserves were too low or too high, or the pressures were off, but for sure people weren't getting water. That definitely is not misinformation. When they were getting reporters out live while the fires were happening, they were asking the firefighters if they had water, and the firefighters were saying no. So I think I just want to make sure that that is clear. I would say that's as open and cut and straightforward as I could possibly imagine it being, which is you're asking the people who are fighting the fires if they have water, and they're saying no. So this could be some type of segment here. So I don't want to make any conspiracy theories here off of this. There's a good chance that they did have a lot of water, but also it seems suspicious that likely the people who are reporting on the capacity of the water are the ones who are in trouble for the water. And obviously the water levels were the biggest thing that was getting criticized. So it is interesting that they said that it was there, but regardless of that case, they still did something wrong such that water wasn't getting to the people who needed it most. And so maybe they're just sort of distracting people with like water levels and debating how high the water was within the reserves, as opposed to like why people weren't getting the water that they needed.
Were at or above historic averages when the fires broke out. But in a letter to LA officials, Newsom called the ongoing reports of the loss of water pressure to some local hydrants during the fires and the reported unavailability of water supplies from the Santa Ynez Reservoir deeply troubling. However, a former city official told the LA Times that given the severity of the fires, the area still would have experienced serious drops in pressure even with that reservoir.
Those distribution systems aren't really designed to manage wildfire, especially wildfire that was spreading at this rate.
Meanwhile,
Yeah, if it was just a pressure case, I think something that they also would have to think about is homes also have water. So there's a good chance that you are losing water pressure from leaks in water for every home that, or every building that was destroyed that has a connection for water. I would have to assume that that caused some issues in and of itself, since these locations were completely devastated at certain points. So likely they were losing pressure to already lost areas. But still, there's clearly an issue there if you're not able to get the water that you need.
state officials are pushing back against claims that environmental policies caused LA to have water problems, as some blamed Newsom and the state's efforts to protect species like the Delta smeltfish by restricting the flow of some water to Southern California.
You're just letting water run into the Pacific because of...
Yeah, I've seen this clip before. I would say definitely my understanding of at least so many people were talking about this, so it could be fake news. I would say that's totally possible, but there is certainly some discussion of some water going there, and obviously this case was built off of the fact that people believed that the reservoirs were at high levels. And I guess to kind of follow up on the level of water that they had, it's also curious that they're also highlighting that they had so much water there of, if they weren't able to actually use the water to put out the fires, then that would also potentially show that you have more water. So this could also be another way that they're sort of making the numbers look a little bit better for themselves. So we'll see what else they have to share, but many people talked about this. Obviously, this clip right here is talking about the smeltfish. I even referenced it because I had seen it so many times referenced. The news mentioned it here. I think President Trump mentioned it himself a number of times. And so it's possible that there's a misunderstanding here of what's going on. So maybe they'll clear it up. But most of this seems to be just calling out the reservoir level. So maybe they'll explain more about what is actually causing the problem.
What, a fish that no one's heard of? Does anybody care about the smelt fish?
Incoming President Trump posted he wanted to protect an essentially worthless fish called a smelt by giving it less water. It didn't work, but didn't care about the people of California. Now the ultimate price is being paid.
So what's happened is a tragedy, and the governor has not done a good job.
What do you say to the criticism that the state has mismanaged water supplies?
I think the facts speak for themselves. The fact that there is water in reservoirs beyond what is average traditionally for the...
I would agree with that person. I think the results do speak for themselves, but this person is seemingly trying to highlight that things went well. Obviously, that was a huge tragedy, and there clearly wasn't enough water for the people who needed it, especially the firefighters who were trying to put out the fires. And I'm sure lives and property could have been saved if there was better handling of that water. It's very curious how they're reporting on this. I feel like they're sort of jumping around to a few things. I'm not sure if they're just trying to kind of correct this misinformation of like maybe it wasn't the smeltfish. But I still feel like they haven't kind of gotten to the chase yet of like, is it just pressure? Is that what they were saying? Is that like something caused the pressure to be gone? That's still an issue that somebody had to have been in charge of and should have made sure was functioning properly for this type of event.
This time of year means that we are moving water when it is available. And I want to be very, very clear. The way that we are moving water and have been moving water and conditions that we're seeing in Southern California around access to that water, it has nothing to do with protected fish species under the law.
Carla Namath and other California officials say one of the biggest issues was actually wind.
The fire is being fueled by a combination of strong winds and surrounding topography, which is
That makes sense. Obviously, the biggest contributing factor to why the fires got so out of hand was due to the wind, because obviously once something started to catch on fire, then it's easier for that fire to move someplace else. I think there were some videos of like, you could literally just see like fire like streaming off of buildings and like trees and things like that. And so that's obviously what helped to spread it. So that I think makes sense. That's what led to the fires being such a catastrophe, was how easy it was for fire to spread into more and more locations. But obviously that's one thing. That's like the natural disaster portion of it. I would say. So this is where, like, if a fire started for whatever reason, the winds are what created the natural disaster that allowed that fire to spread and create what could have been potentially a small problem and turned into a really big problem. But that doesn't necessarily mean that water and its availability didn't lead to things getting so out of hand. That'd be similar to blaming like a hurricane and saying like the water or the wind was the primary factor. Of course, that is true. That's the premise of natural disasters, is that there's some natural force that makes them as bad as they are. But what is actually negatively impacting the people in the community there, the government and other officials have responsibility for how those things are handled. Because we've seen some situations where hurricanes come in and they completely decimate certain locations. There's many lives lost. And we've seen situations where if people get warned and they're actually appropriately evacuated and things are handled properly, the loss of life and property can be drastically reduced, or certainly at least life. And so I think that's the biggest issue here. They do seem to be getting to the point of like what could be really causing these problems. And so maybe they'll get to that still.
Making it extremely challenging for our personnel that are assigned to this incident.
Is there anything California or LA officials could have done better to mitigate the threat of these fires?
There will be lots of opportunity after this event to understand what happened, and we will learn from that, and especially in the context of climate, and we will adjust and move forward. I think it's really important for folks to understand that a fire suppression strategy for a wildland fire is not dealt with localized community fire hydrants. It's just not the right scale.
So that's an interesting piece. It's curious to see. It seems like they were mostly trying to highlight the fact that, like, while the smelt wasn't actually a big cause for this, but curious, it didn't really tie a lot of things together for me. I feel like I was looking for a little bit more out of this. And it also feels like they went fairly soft on the government here of, they basically just said, yeah, they did have a good amount of water. They didn't even say anything that they could have done better, and that they'll think about it at a future time. Obviously, things could have gone better than what it was. Even in a scenario where things go very well, or as well as they could have done from like a response standpoint, there's always things to learn. So it almost felt like they were sort of pulling back on responsibility for these individuals, which was odd. Especially because I don't think that there's that many people, or maybe that's the entire point. Maybe Wall Street Journal is trying to kind of be a devil's advocate here in some of these cases. So it is thought-provoking. It is nice to see someone kind of fight for the opposite case and kind of make sure that there is some transparency here. But it felt like they were just letting them off the hook to some extent. I don't know. What did you guys think? If you have thoughts, please add them in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching. And if you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.